stay here, then things change for them. I mean, they really have to then consider if they're going to deal him, because if he says, I'm opting out after this year and I'm going somewhere else, if you're the Spurs, you have to really consider the possibility of either trying to trade him or really, like as you said, kind of starting the rebuild. Um, and I mean, I think it's interesting to wonder if other teams would have an interest. I mean, you have to wonder if a team like the Heat, maybe a team like the Pistons, maybe the Timberwolves, maybe the Kings, some teams like that might be interested in potentially making a trade if that happens. But I think you're right. And before we get into any trades or anything, I do think that this team has a lot of talent. And one of the things that I think people are kind of overlooking is that one of the guys who was really expected to be a breakout player last year, Dejounte Murray, he is going to be back and seems to be healthy. And you're going to combine him with Derek White and Patty Mills in the backcourt. That's a heck of a backcourt that they've got. You combine that with DeRozan and Aldridge, that's a really nice little team. And Rudy Gay kind of turned back the clock a year ago, so they will have a really nice team. The question, Jason, to me is kind of as we get into the look at this team, what is their ceiling? Ultimately, how far can they go, and are there any players that you're kind of looking at to analyze
I,
that?
I think Derek White's in for a huge year. He had that international experience. Didn't play too much in FIBA, but was there with Popovich. So, Pop trusts him. And with Popovich, from the outside looking in, trust obviously goes a long way. I think their ceiling could be the second round of the playoffs in the West, which is an accomplishment in and of itself because of how stacked the West is, because we've barely mentioned Denver over the last couple of weeks when talking about these West powerhouses. You have Utah, Portland, the LA teams, Houston, Golden State. So the Spurs have their work cut out for them. So I think their ceiling realistically would be the second round of the playoffs. What worries me, though, is their lack of front court depth behind LaMarcus Aldridge, because outside of Jakob Poeltl, they don't really have too many big men that they could count on. I think DeMar Carroll and Rudy Gay, those two veterans on the wings, will contribute. You mentioned how solid they are at the point guard position, and Aldridge, as the lone steady big man on that roster, he's an injury concern. So if he goes down, the Spurs are going to be lacking some serious front court depth. So before we get into the floor, do you agree that the second round is an interesting ceiling, or do you think they'll finish elsewhere?
So I have to say, I think it's honestly pretty hard for me to picture them winning a first round series. Last year, they were the seventh seed, and they might be a little bit better with Dejounte Murray, but I don't think they're much better. And the only team that was ahead of them that is going to dramatically fall is the Thunder, and then you'd expect the Warriors to kind of fall off. But, I mean, the Warriors are still a pretty good team. So even if you take them, the Clippers and the Lakers are much, much better than they were a year ago. So it's really hard to imagine the Spurs really finishing ahead of any of those teams. And if they finish with one of the bottom two or three seeds, Jason, I can't imagine them doing it. I think their ceiling would be somehow managing to get a top four seed, but even still, I think it's something like a top four seed in a competitive first round series. I just don't see how they're going to make it out of the first round this year with the amount of talent around them.
Well, that's why I'm saying second round would be their absolute ceiling. I'm not sitting here saying they're
Yeah,
going
yeah.
to be making a Western Conference Finals run. But then on the flip side of things, Ben, the floor could be missing the postseason because there could be 8 teams in the West that are better than them. We'll get to the Pelicans later. I've been high on them all summer. You have all these other up-and-coming teams in the West that the Spurs, if they have one bad stretch in the middle of the season, that could be the difference between making the playoffs and completely missing the playoffs. And what comes with that floor is something we were talking about earlier. If Pop decides to finally walk away from the Spurs, coach the 2020 Olympics, and then retire, the Spurs could be headed towards a rebuild. So this is a big year for them because the scales could tip either way, I think, depending on how the season shakes out.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And to me, the worst case is that DeRozan says partway through the season, I'm not signing in San Antonio. I'm gonna exercise my player option and go elsewhere, and they have to trade him for basically pennies on the dollar. And suddenly the Spurs are kind of stuck in the middle. they have Aldridge, they have these other guys, but they're not really able to compete, and they're just kind of stuck. To me, that's the worst case for them, is that they sort of end up in no man's land. And it feels a little bit like they're there already, because it's hard to see how the Spurs can get back to competing for championships with the current roster. It would take a pretty big move, and it just shows how much obviously the Kawhi Leonard departure hurt them. But Jason, the over/under for this team is set at 46.5 wins. So are you taking the over or the under?
I am Yakapurtling over this wall that we are building here on Baseline Jumper. Not the Trump wall. We are building our own wall that is going to be filled with rainbows and lollipops. But that being said, you can't count out the Spurs. I'll be surprised if they do hit their floor, and then this era could really be over in San Antonio, but I'm taking the over.
Yeah, I'm doing the same. I mean, as much as I have some concerns, it's just hard to bet against them. They're like death and taxes, man. They just come back every year. You can't count them out. So we're both going over there. And then the other team, I think, the second of three teams in our Texas Triangle here in this division, is the Houston Rockets. And they are really, really interesting. They've done some creative little things. They just signed Nene to the most interesting contract I think you'll ever see, Jason. A 2-year, $20 million deal with only the veterans minimum guaranteed. Just a classic Morey deal. And, ultimately this is a team that made a huge move this offseason, Jason. After being really a contender, they decided to go get Russell Westbrook for a few first-round picks. And, of course, Chris Paul. Now it's Westbrook and Harden back together again. They've got Clint Capella in the fold. They've got some other pieces. I mean, what do you make of this team, Jason? And do you think that they're better than a year ago with with Westbrook?
Well, everyone gave them flack for paying Chris Paul $40 million a year last year to keep him in Houston. But had Morey not did that, he would not have had the salaries to match in a trade with Oklahoma City. So Chris Paul had his time in Houston, and he's gone. He's in Oklahoma City now. So they go out, they get one of James Harden's best friends in the league in Russell Westbrook. And to the Houston Rockets, I say it's now or never. I think Morey, under new ownership, responded to huge off seasons from both the Lakers and the Clippers by acquiring Westbrook to play alongside Harden. You add in the payday Eric Gordon just got, the money Clint Capella's been getting paid, and this team is massively hard-capped. So I do think they have the talent to win it all. But if things go sour, oh boy, do they have money tied up in their superstars, man. We were talking in our free agency breakdown about how they barely had enough to fill out the roster. We mentioned some concerns with depth. Looking at the roster as it's constructed today, I feel a little bit better about it, because you can't doubt a team that has two of what were the 10 best players in the NBA. I think Westbrook's kind of fallen down a tier a little bit, but the two of them together is going to be fun to watch, because it's not the young Thunder anymore. It's two superstars leading the way in Houston.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we're going to watch them get Andre Iguodala. This contract that they just signed Nene to was basically their foray into the Andre Iguodala sweepstakes. I mean, I don't think you can interpret it many other ways. They are looking to get Iguodala. They want to add him. There's been rumors linking them, and now that contract paves the way. It's going to be worth $10 million, but only 2.5 and change are guaranteed. That means for a team like the Grizzlies, who's not going to have, that they will have no interest in keeping Nene, they can basically trade for him as if he's a $10 million contract, and then cut him as if he's only a $2.5 million contract. So that is, the Rockets' creative way of getting themselves into that sweepstakes, and they really only have to attach a small other asset. So, I mean, I feel like that's bordering on a foregone conclusion. I feel like there's a really good chance that might even get done before the season starts at this point. But as the roster is currently constructed, the one thing that you notice, Jason, is that they're going to really have some trouble with a team like the Clippers, because they just really lack depth on the wing. I mean, outside of Eric Gordon, my goodness, they are just really, really thin on the wings. I mean, when you read their rotation out there, it is tough, man. I mean, that is a tough wing rotation. They're going to really need PJ Tucker to play a lot of power forward as well because his backup is Gary Clark. And after that, right now, is the immortal Anthony Bennett, former first round pick. I mean, we'll see what ends up shaking out. It seems like there's going to be some cuts and so on. But that's what's showing on their depth chart. I think they still have Fareed on there as well. So there's going to be some interesting shakeup on this team, but the depth
Fareed's
is
a free
tough.
agent. Fareed's a free agent. He's gone. That was an expiring deal. When he got traded to the Nets, he was on an expiring contract. So when they waived him, he signed with Houston. That wasn't only guaranteed for last year. I mean, the big man rotation is Capella and Tyson Chandler, who they signed. So I think they're fine at the center position. They're loaded in the backcourt. But you're absolutely right. The wings are really where they're going to struggle in a conference where wing depth is everything. You hit the nail on the head, sir. So I think that's going to be Houston's bugaboo. But they did add some depth to the roster. And when you have a duo like Harden Westbrook, I mean, we talked about DeRozan and Aldridge. Harden and Westbrook, I mean, it's hard to pick, 3 or 4 duos over them when both of them are at the top of their games. And I think Russ has a ton to prove after a lot of people in the media are saying he's, fallen off a bit, taking a step back. His shooting's not there. He's lost some athleticism because he prides his entire game off of his athleticism. But you're putting 2 triple-double machines together on a nightly basis, and opposing defenses are going to be really, really troubled when trying to game plan against this team.
No, you're absolutely right, and it's going to be tough. I mean, I apologize. You're right. Kenneth Faried is no longer on this team, although it's hard to believe given how light they are in terms of their depth. But yeah, they have some real trouble right now filling out this roster. I mean, there's a really, really good chance that if they decide to get Iguodala, they're going to be trading Daniel House, and that will only further deplete their depth on the team. I mean, you're really looking at a team that if they make a trade like that, you're not going to have much more than 7 or so players, and that's got to make you worried for a team that's seen Harden kind of slow down come playoff time the last few seasons, and frankly, kind of the same thing has happened with Westbrook. So it's a little worrisome for this team, but ultimately, when you look at the ceiling, I mean, I don't think there's any two ways about it, Jason. I mean, it's them playing for the championship. Ultimately, that's what they want. That's what they're targeting. And with 2 guys who you could arguably say are 2 of the top 10 players in the league, I don't know if I would agree with it, but I think you could make the case. They certainly have that as their ceiling. Do you agree?
I do. I think it's going to be real fun to watch the 2 of them go up against Kawhi and Paul George, LeBron and Anthony Davis, Steph and Clay. I mean, we're going to be seeing some tough battles. In a 7-game series, sign me up, quit my job, do this podcast 24/7, and just watch basketball because it's going to be really, really exciting. Their ceiling is definitely NBA champions. I mean, they have some hurdles to overcome in order to make that happen, but how could you say anything less than that for their ceiling?
Yeah, absolutely. And I had been kind of holding out to mention this until we got to the floor, but one of those hurdles that you're talking about, Jason, is that Westbrook and Harden aren't the best fit in the world. I mean, Harden is a great player, not exactly known for his defense. Westbrook has been just consistently overrated on that end, is not a great defender in his own right, and has not shown really much willingness to play off the ball. And now these 2 are going to be together, and one of them or both of them are going to really have to adjust their games to better fit one another, something that neither one of them has done a whole lot. I think Westbrook probably has done it a little bit better as his career's gone on. Last year, we really saw him kind of adjust his game for Paul George, but there is a real concern here, Jason, that those 2 could really struggle to play together. And especially when you talk about a team that really doesn't have a whole lot of bench players, it's going to be especially hard for them to split up their minutes because the minutes when really only one of them is on the floor, it's going to be potentially a kind of a tough way for D'Antoni to play because there's just not that much talent behind their starting lineup. So if those two aren't playing a fairly